A few months back, I made a video series talking about the history of Roman paganism, how it had grown from its early origins to become the vast religion of an empire. However, I said one thing in that series that got me a lot of angry comments. Namely, that I didn't really buy the idea that Rome had inherited their mythology from this much more ancient group of peoples, the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Now, the picture that had been painted for me by these comments was some version of the following. There had been a people who lived in the steppe and then migrated outwards, getting all the way from Ireland to Germany to Anatolia to even northern India, basically this entire range. Now, this had been a patriarchal culture with a strong military focus, and as a result, when they met a lot of the native peoples who were already living in these lands, they would conquer them, eradicate most of their men, and then take their wives as concubines. Since the children of these nomadic raiders were raised in this patriarchal society, they ended up only inheriting their father's culture, and therefore the culture of the indigenous people to these lands was essentially overwritten by these nomadic invaders. Some people claimed entirely, some people claimed only so much as to make whatever original culture had been there unrecognizable. And some people also claimed there had been more of a fusion, but that the Proto-Indo-Europeans were a much larger part of that eventual fusion. The evidence they offered ranged from DNA analysis to comparative mythology, to even some linguistic analysis. So, ready to see where I'd gone wrong, I cracked open Mallory, Polville, Littleton, West, Harl, Lincoln, and even went back into Dumezil a bit. And what I found did change my opinion, but only insofar that I got really concerned that so many people believed this. Like, here's a good example. Most people in my video told me that the reason Roman and Greek myth was so similar was because they had both been inherited from these Proto-Indo-European ancestors. And that's a theory I've seen repeated all over the internet. But if you read Mallory, West, Littleton, or just go to the Wikipedia page for Proto-Indo-European mythology, you'll almost immediately see that Greek religion is not considered Proto-Indo-European in nature. And you don't just have to take my word for it. Even Dumezil, the progenitor of the modern theory, himself would state, even the most considerable traits of the Proto-Indo-European heritage were profoundly modified in Greece. Although I know it would make for better clickbait, I don't really want to call it a conspiracy theory. It's more like the version of the Proto-Indo-European theory that's popular online is a gross mischaracterization of scholarly articles on the subject, and is based on a misconstruing of evidence, ignoring contradictory details, and basically just twisting everything it can in order to tell a really cool story. So I figured the best thing to do would be to clear it all up. If you've never heard of the Proto-Indo-European, I'm getting very tired of saying that. I'm just going to say PIE going forward. If you've never heard of the PIE mythology, you are in for a crazy story and then finding out why it's wrong. And if you have heard of PIE, you're in for a different kind of crazy story, and you're going to learn why peering back into the past is actually a lot harder than it seems. As always, my sources, noted on screen like this, will be in the companion document listed in the video description. And I know I always say this, but I'm really going to encourage you, if you disagree with anything I'm saying, check my sources, because some of the stuff we're going to get into, I think, is going to be really surprising to the very big fans of this theory. Oh, and in case you think this is just like a smug post, I was also wrong about the theory. I ended up being right in my conclusions, but for the wrong reasons. So I also am guilty of the sin we're about to get into. So let's start with the basics, because while the overall theory and history is pretty straightforward, not sticking to the basics, as you'll see, is where I think a lot of people get lost. If you're curious who the PIE peoples were, you might be interested to know we actually have zero concrete evidence about their existence. Yet, even despite that, we're certain that they did exist. How? Through the magic of reconstructive philology. Okay, I know, just chill. I promise that's way less scary than it sounds. Philology is the study of language, specifically how languages change, evolve, and grow over time. So while, yes, I technically could have said linguistics, the proper term is philology, and proper terms make you sound smart. Sometimes this evolution is natural, called genetic evolution, which, yes, will get confusing later. Sometimes this happens through loan words, like with restaurant in Japanese, or beef in English. And sometimes this evolution is forced, like with broad Scots. As always, I do not apologize to my Scottish listeners. For example, sometimes words swap the order of two letters, like the Old English thrida becoming our modern English third. Thanks, Wikipedia. And sometimes you get a new syllable appearing in between two previously existing syllables, like how I and many others say jewelry.
Buy Factory Direct, the jewelry exchange in Sudbury.
This honestly could be an entire video in and of itself, but I'm really bad at accents and I want to just get to the PIE. So we're just going to use one example we can kind of use as a cheat sheet going forward. We know that the word for coward in French and Spanish both come from the Latin caude. In Spanish, it's cobarde, and in French, it's caud. So you can see how in both the first A became an O, and in French, they dropped the E and then swapped the order of the U and the A, and both added an R. These are all commonly accepted rules. Just trust me, bro. Now, it's not always this straightforward, and in fact, it's often far more complicated. For example, in English, we have the word cow for the animal and also beef for the meat of that animal. Now, we got beef as a loanword from French, though I protest the term loanword because it's not like we're giving it back anytime soon. This is because William the Conqueror from Normandy in modern-day France wasn't too hasty and took over England, at which point most of the nobility in England were all speaking French. And as they were eating most of the meat, they would ask for boeuf and mouton and pork. Not sure why they didn't like chicken, but there you go. Poultry. Oh my God, poultry. How did I forget that one? But to throw even another wrench into this, William the Conqueror was descended from the original people who had been granted Normandy by Charles the Simple, aka Vikings. So we have a French loanword in English because of Vikings. Like I said, it gets complicated, but you don't have to worry about that until later. So pretty early on in the Renaissance era, when we were starting to formalize and specialize education, and the polymaths were becoming monogomaths, we started to figure out that most languages actually came from older languages. This led to all sorts of fun experiments, including my favorite, where Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II locked two babies in a room to see what language they'd speak. And if you want to know the results, the kids died. They died. That's what happened. So maybe the actual original language was infant mortality. But a bit later, 1500s, England was finally stable. No more civil wars. And so they were going into withdrawal and went to a bunch of other countries to see if maybe they could stir up some wars over there. You know, scratch that itch of dying fighting your brother. One guy, Father Thomas Stevens, the eponymous first Englishman in India, noted all the way back in 1583 that many are the languages of Goa. Their pronunciation is not disagreeable, and their structure is allied to that of Greek and Latin. Also, unrelated to anything else we're talking about, Stevens also recounts this story of a guy he's going to Goa to like do missionary work, convert people to Christianity, and in order to convert them, he's trying to preach the word of God in the temples, and they don't care. So he wants to scare away the heathens. So he first tries to burn down the temple, and then he slaughters a cow like in the middle of the temple to like annoy them and scare them all off so that he can preach the word of God, like without anyone bothering him. So anyway, the Indians show up and they kill him, because they're a little miffed about disrespecting their temple. And then Stevens is like, and these horrible barbarians, they even plucked out his eye when we were just trying to save their souls. I don't even see what the big deal was. Which is just like, this is so much to ask, to just like be able to go back in time and be like a criminally oblivious missionary. Taking the similarities in these languages when compared to, say, the Arabian Peninsula or Northern Africa or East Asia or what have you, philologists came up with a theory that has held pretty solid to this day. The theory of the Proto-Indo-European language, often just called Proto-Indo-European. First formalized in 1786, it was solidified in the early 18th century, almost paralleling American history enough for me to make a joke about it. Using reconstructive methods, philologists started to come up with a system by which you could determine which words might be able to be ascribed to this Proto-Indo-European language. J.P. Mallory, in his book In Search of the Indo-Europeans, actually has a pretty nice rule that you have to have one word from one European language and at least one word from an Indo-Iranian language, though some introduce a few more or fewer caveats depending. So by the middle of the 19th century, the Proto-Indo-European language was all but confirmed. With the PIE language receiving popular support, a natural question arose in the minds of scholars. If there was a language, didn't that imply there was a people who spoke that language? And thus, PIE cultural reconstructions began. Now, how we reconstructed certain elements of PIE culture is really cool, and as you'll see, Some of these claims hold up even today. But this method of reconstruction is also where all the trouble started. Now, speaking of trouble and culture, there's something I'd actually like your help with. Yes, you, the person watching this video. There's a culture that's very much under attack right now, and it's one that I think is pretty worthwhile trying to save. I'm speaking, of course, of Ukraine. I think a lot of you believe, much like I do, that countries have a right to self-determination, and that we should help countries defend that right, even when our leaders don't. So I'm raising money for Car for Ukraine, an NGO founded in 2022, the year of the invasion, that is primarily focused on buying trucks, armoring them, and then shipping them to the front lines, where they serve as personnel carriers, supply runs, missile cars, and sometimes shields. Like, check this out. Isn't this sick? Like, you don't want to support this? Like, and, you know, if you're like super anti-military industrial complex, this is just a grassroots organization. Like, they just kind of started their own thing here. Like, they make all their own armor. It's all done in Ukraine. It's just 9mm steel plating. Like, it's not like, you know, they're not buying like Northrop Grumman stuff to put on there. These white pages show exactly how much money they spend per truck. So you know how your donation is being used to save lives. It's all handled by DonorBox, which is a trusted third-party organization that handles donations for charitable organizations. This isn't a sponsorship, by the way. I'm not getting a single penny out of this. Everything you donate is going to go directly to the organization because I care about this cause a lot. And to prove that, I'm actually going to jump in front of all of you and donate $500. I want to do some good with this community we're building, and I think this is a really good place to start. If you care about freedom and cars, I guess, if you care about cars getting blown up, which is just kind of cool, chuck $1 or $2, and you can do that at the link in the description. I'll remind you again at the end of the video as well, because that's what I'm supposed to call you all to action. But for now, let's get back to my spite research. The first method used in PIE cultural reconstruction is pretty straightforward. See if they have a word for something, and if they do, they probably knew about that thing. And pretty quickly, it told us some interesting things. The PIE language has several words for things related to pottery, including clay, pot, and like a jug used for water. This would indicate that the PIE people had some knowledge of pottery, which allows us to place them in time. Knowledge of pottery also implies knowledge of the wheel, which, you know, pottery is a little more impressive than the wheel, but still. There's actually a long encyclopedia I'm going to link in the companion doc from 97, I think it was, that lists a ton of these words, their etymologies, how they relate to each other. It's a really cool read. They had many words for farm animals like pig, chicken, and cow, and they even had a word for dog. But what's clear from the sheer number of words is their most important animal was the horse. They have a word for horse, of course, but also specific types of horses like foal, mare, and stallion. They also have a word for post, like something you tie a horse to, and hoof, the thing that horses have, and also the word for ride, as in to ride a horse. The author of the book Empires of the Steppe actually talks about how it's theorized they may have first kept horses for food in the winter and then later started riding them. This paints a picture of a pastoral society focused on animal husbandry that had a basic knowledge of woodworking and pottery. Now, as cool as a picture as that might paint, the big problem is we don't know how incomplete that painting might be. Remember, we're just basing this off the things that they have words for. But as much as I keep saying things they have words for, these are just reconstructions. And the only things that we can reconstruct are based off of words that survived into later languages. And the huge problem with that is we don't know what was lost in that transition.
And I'm not just making all these problems up. J.P. Mallory talks about how comparative cultural reconstructions, much like comparative religious reconstructions, run into a lot of problems, stating, often this makes for the best of reading, but the entire logic of such an approach, at least when applied to the more obviously functional categories of culture, is certainly suspect. We may be struck by the similarities between the heroes of medieval Germanic and Irish tales, and the Indic war god Indra who leads his band of hell-raising Murats through the hymns of the Rig Veda, but their behavior is more apt to be generic responses to their particular cultural circumstances than the direct genetic inheritance from common ancestors and institutions which existed thousands of years earlier. To suggest otherwise is to assume implicitly that the structural organization of warfare among Indo-Europeans remained essentially static for several thousands of years. In short, We cannot be entirely confident in our reconstructions when they are based solely on the ethnographic residue of later Indo-European peoples.
Let me give you an example. Let's say I can travel back in time and I find out that the PIE peoples actually had this plant that was super important to their culture. This twisty, viney grape cousin that they called narg. Now, I see this plant everywhere when I go back. So it turns out they were actually a hardcore agricultural society. And all the stuff for animals and dogs and whatnot, that's kind of stuff just kept for the wealthier members of the tribe, luxury items. Then something happens. Maybe the soil's depleted of nutrients, an earthquake diverts some river so they can't irrigate it anymore or what have you. And now they have to leave. They have to go spread the PIE language to all corners of the earth because they can't grow narg there anymore. And they don't bring narg with them because they figure it's just stopped growing, period. As a result, none of the languages that came from PIE are going to have a memory of this word because words are just used to convey concepts. And concepts only make sense if the culture has an understanding of that concept. But perhaps they had a word related to narg, say, gnarled. And we see that word reflected in German and Sanskrit. And so we say, this must be a PIE word. But we don't understand culturally how important that word was to them. By the way, gnarled, from what we know, comes from Proto-Germanic. And we can't find an Indo-Iranian cousin. So that's actually probably not a PIE word. I specifically wanted to pick something that wasn't a PIE word, so I didn't spread my own conspiracy theory. But this is just an example of how missing certain pieces of information can completely change the way you view things. Now, what is safe to say, and what most modern PIE cultural reconstruction is based off of, is again, that very simple basic rule. If they had a word for it, it probably was a thing. So they have a word for chief, for example. So they probably had some kind of tribal leader. And they also have words for niece and nephew. So they probably had some awareness and importance placed on extended families. Very broad statements like this are perfectly fine and safe to say. But to say, well, if they acknowledged extended families and they had tribal leaders, it's not unreasonable when you look at the culture of later peoples who spoke Proto-Indo-European descended languages, that they had some sort of hereditary leadership, is wrong to say. Because that's adding more information than we actually have access to. And again, just because I know a bunch of people are about to comment, well, actually, which for the record is my shtick, go get your own, what's to stop me from saying, no, they clearly didn't have a hereditary kingship. It probably was just the oldest male, because them, acknowledging extended families means that they probably organized themselves into family structures, and therefore the oldest male of any given family would be the ruler of that tribe. And look, this matches up with later Roman social structure, with the paterfamilias. And if your response to that starts with, well, maybe, but, you're proving my point, because the maybe is the issue. Because anything else you want to build after that point, any broader cultural implication you want to draw, has to acknowledge that it's starting from a maybe. We can make guesses, but we don't have an answer key. We don't have any kind of evidence of these people that we could ever use to answer this question. So I'm really going to try and hammer this home. It is almost completely futile to try and reconstruct a culture from just a language, because culture is really fluid and really varied. And trying to discern a culture or a way of life from cultures that existed in the best case scenario, like 3,000 years later, is almost going to be impossible. That's like trying to determine what early Christianity was like based solely on the evidence of modern day Christianity. Now, to the people getting ready to type the comment that we can do that, there are plenty of things in modern Christianity that we can trace back to early Christianity. I'll remind you that you can only say that because you have the answer key. You know what early you don't know. There's evidence that we can use to support what early Christianity was like. If I asked you where baptism came from, you might be able to guess drowning. You might. But if I responded with, no, clearly doesn't come from drowning, it comes from bathing, washing yourself clean of original sin. To respond with, no, it's clearly being born again in the covenant, your old self dying, that your new self might live together with Christ, we wouldn't know. If we didn't have like the early church fathers to go off of, we're just going to be stuck arguing without any real way to get to the truth of the matter. Now, if we actually uncover some archaeology of these people at some point, then yeah, that's great. We can use that evidence in conjunction with the linguistic evidence to draw some more serious conclusions about their culture. But even then, anyone who happens to get something right just off the linguistic evidence was just lucky. They just happened to guess right. So I'm not using this to say this specific type of reconstruction is just impossible. I'm just saying that what we're doing, we can't ever do with certainty. And therefore, any cultural institutions you try and build off this evidence have to have that uncertainty included within that. I know some people are still going to take issue with that. So before you leave your angry comments, I will put a much more detailed explanation at this footnote. Actually, why am I saying that? No, sorry. Comment, like, subscribe, share, do the engagement stuff. Then check my sources. First trust, then verify. And if you're going to try and accuse me of not practicing what I preach, remember, I am the hedge king. I often tell you when I do not necessarily have enough evidence to back up my theory and encourage you to disagree with me. Frankly, in much the same way that I was accidentally right about Roman paganism, I guess you could probably say that I just fell for the opposite of the traps I just described. Because again, I really want to stress this. The Proto-Indo-European language almost certainly existed. And if that language existed, there almost certainly was a group of people who spoke that language. And as we'll get into later when we get to the DNA evidence, there almost certain was a migration at some point. Maybe not of the Proto-Indo-Europeans themselves, but anyway, we'll get to that in the later section. But there was some sort of migration that happened. The problem, and the thing that I'm trying to push back against here, is the idea that that migration destroyed the indigenous cultures of everyone from Ireland to India. And if you want to take issue with me being hyperbolic and destroyed and say, oh, we didn't say destroyed, they fused. Okay, if they did fuse, it was not more than like 2080 or something like that. I don't know, pick whatever. Whatever would make you fight with me about the statement, that's what I'm making. I'd say even if you'd say 40% of all these religions are Proto-Indo-European, I would push back on that. I think if you go above like 20, 25, that's probably where I'd start fighting with you. Maybe I could deal with like 75 indigenous, 25% Proto-Indo-European, but okay, so we are done with the groundwork. Thank you for actually watching all that and not just skipping to the next section, which I'm not going to put in the chapter marker until after this sentence, so the skippers won't know that I'm ragging on them. It's our little secret. Now recall, the theory that's popular on the internet, the one people were saying I wasn't considering enough, is that this reconstruction can actually expand beyond culture and go into mythology. To give a very oversimplified version of the theory I'm pushing back against, there are a lot of similarities in mythologies that are shared between people who speak an Indo-European language. And those similarities aren't purely related to the myth. You can actually add some etymological elements in there. So much in the same way earlier I was saying, maybe if we find archaeology, we can use that with linguistics. With myth, they're claiming that if you can compare these myths, you can add that in to etymological evidence to draw some conclusions about what the Proto-Indo-European mythology might have been like, and maybe even the outline of their religion. Because if we assume the language and culture were spread, we can also assume the mythology was spread as well. Now, this theory claims it owes itself to George Dumezil, the new thorn in my channel's side. Problem is, though, Dumezil himself would not agree with the modern form of this theory that you find on the internet. In fact, that nuance is something that Dumezil was working on very hard for most of his later career. And I'm not even like reaching there, because most people who talk about this theory don't mention what Dumezil's central thesis was, nor what he was trying to demonstrate with it. So let's briefly go over Dumezil's career path, how he developed his theory, and what the core thesis of his theory was once he'd found his footing. And then, just for fun, at the end, we'll see how that theory holds up today in modern scholarly circles. By the way, most of this timeline comes from Scott Littleton's retrospective, which is a great read, honestly, if you're interested in it. While I will link some of Dumezil's work where appropriate, most of his work is in French and was never actually translated into English. So I'm trusting Littleton a little more than I'd normally trust a scholar here. However, that actually ends up working out in my favor, because Littleton was actually a pretty big fan of Dumezil. Also, Dumezil was not the first to attempt the PIE Mythological Reconstruction. So check the companion doc if you want to read more about that. Dumezil's first real foray into the space was with his comparative study of Indo-European mythology, in which he takes a look at a couple disparate myths and draws a similar story, namely that there's some sort of drink, either that grants or is representative of immortality in some way, and it is then lost through trickery. Dumezil also asserts this myth is embedded in myths like Prometheus stealing fire and the Holy Grail. However, he would come to regret using both of those as examples. He further references the well-known rituals of preparing alcoholic drinks in religious or semi-religious rituals, including soma, madhu, and mead. Soma is used in many Hindu rituals, and in the original texts was said to be a drink that granted immortality. To top it all off, mead and medu can actually be reconstructed into the Proto-Indo-European word medu. Now this sounds pretty good, right? I mean, you got the comparative mythology, you got the etymological references, and look, one of them, mead, is from an European language, and medu is from an Indo-Iranian language, so that meets Mallory's standard. I mean, the whole thing seems pretty good. And if you look at many PIE wikis, theories, and videos you can find on the internet today, you'll find many references to this so-called ambrosia cycle, with most of them crediting Dumezil. Now, this evidence even seemed pretty convincing to me, but when I was doing research for this theory, I kept getting frustrated because I couldn't find anyone dealing with one of the biggest critics to this theory, Dumezil himself. Yes, here's the first big twist of the video, and one that caught me completely off guard. George Dumezil, in the height of his career, did not believe in comparative mythology in the way it is used in the specific theory I'm pushing back against. Now, to be fair, in his younger years, when he was starting out, for the first 10-ish, 5 to 10 years of his career, he used this all the time. But when he was exposed to peer review and other scholars critiquing his work, he realized the problems with this method of reconstruction and largely abandoned it for the eventual theory that he would be known for. And if you're thinking, well, what does it matter if he doesn't agree with our end conclusion? We're just using his evidence. You're free to do that. Frankly, I've done stuff like that myself. The problem is when you're using his evidence without considering even once why he wouldn't buy into your conclusions. Dumezil wouldn't abandon PIE mythological reconstruction right away. He'd actually have a few more theories that would directly deal with that methodology. The problem of the centaurs and the binding deities. I do apologize. I have to look at my script for this next one because I cannot keep the pronunciation of these words in my head. For centaurs, Dumezil compares the Greek ones to the Iranian Gandharvas, Hindu Gandharvas, musical divinities typically depicted as half human, half bird, or half human, half horse, and Roman Faunas. I guess I didn't actually need to look down for that one. His reconstruction of the word Guandro, and I can't even do the Google voice thing for that one because this is a Proto-Indo-European word, is shaky at best. It stretches the limits of PIE sound change laws. Although, according to Littleton, who is referencing Polville, it is technically within the bounds of what is possible, though Polville himself is actually skeptical of this reconstruction. Now, with centaurs specifically, another linguistic problem here rears its ugly head, namely that languages within the same family often borrow words from each other, creatively known as intrafamilial borrowing. Much like beef and cow run into problems as we went over earlier, both still technically come from the exact same Proto-Indo-European word, yet their paths to English were not the same. And on top of that, the roles that these mythical creatures played was pretty different. I mean, if you look at the Hindu deities, they're very peaceful, they're like heavenly creatures, they're singing and playing music. Now that sort of gets to fauns, and fauns are sort of like centaurs in that they have the horniness thing. And then, it's just you can kind of map one element of one onto one element of another, and then a second element of that second one onto one element of the third, and sort of get there. But it's just a little too weak to claim that there was some central thing all three of them came from. Dumezil then tried to compare Oranos with Varuna, claiming they both came from the theoretical reconstruction Oreno. Now, this was not a widely accepted reconstruction even at the time, and Dumezil himself would again back off from this. The claim was they were both deities in binding roles, as Varuna bound sinners and Ouranos bound his children when he imprisoned them in Tartarus, which, I mean, is kind of a stretch. Like at that point, Yahweh is also a binding deity because he bound Lucifer to hell. Well, I guess, okay, not in the original Hebrew text, but what's a better example? Apophis, right? Apophis, the Egyptian deity, the night, right? He was bound, he was fettered by the Egyptian priests. Well, in myth by Ra, but same thing. Does that make Ra a binding deity? You get it. It's a stretch is the point. He tries to compare Varuna's impotence, an important and recurring theme in the Atharva Veda, with Ouranos' castration, even though Ouranos already had kids of his own, so it wasn't like he was impotent, and then his castration itself actually gave birth to more creatures. So Indiologists even at the time would take exception to this, though. Varuna is not just a binding deity. Varuna also unbinds sinners. They're in charge of both, whereas Ouranos just bound his children. There was no unbinding or anything related to that. As I said, Dumezil himself would reject these claims less than 10 years later, but he'd actually go a lot farther than that, because here's the second big twist that I already kind of gave away at the very beginning of the video. Dumezil, and also his later followers and other comparative mythologists, would not and do not see Hellenism as a Proto-Indo-European religion. As a rough translation of Littleton's included quote from Dumezil's 1958 work, The Tripartite Ideology of the Indo-Europeans, which never got an English translation, Dumezil says, Greece, probably because of the Greek miracle, and also because the oldest civilizations of the Aegean Sea were so strongly influenced by invaders from the north, contributes less to the comparative study. Even the most considerable features of the heritage were profoundly modified there. But I'm sure you're wondering, if Dumezil didn't believe in this specific type of reconstructive comparative mythology, what was he even writing about from the 40s to the 70s? What was the thing that got him so much fame, acclaim, and infamy? And the answer is Dumezil's biggest contribution to the field of comparative mythology. And even though it's been pushed back on so much that even his most devout students only support wildly expanded variants of it, it's still an excellent example of how comparative mythology was used in its heyday. Dumezil's theory of Indo-European tripartism, which is also sometimes called trifunctionalism, because, hey, why make it easy? This is a very dense and complicated theory that, frankly, could be its own video of a similar length. So I'm just going to give the briefest of overviews, but I am going to link a bunch more articles and other things you can read if you want to do more research in the companion document at this footnote. Though again, I'm going to start with the caveat that the specific theory of Dumezil's we're about to get into does not have widespread support in the modern scholarly community, although certain elements of his theory have stuck around as very useful frames, if not for their original intention. Sometime in the 1930s, Dumezil turned his attention towards a framework or structure he kept seeing repeated in a lot of these mythological tropes from the Proto-Indo-European speaking peoples, something he would come to call the three functions. Dumezil came to see these functions as reflective of overarching societal structures which can be seen in the later Indo-European language family-speaking peoples, and to him spoke to an overarching Proto-Indo-European societal structure reflected in later mythology that we could potentially glean through comparative analysis. However, before we get into this, I need to add yet another caveat, because really I got to make Dumezil's position on this crystal clear. Dumezil did not see this structure as necessarily existing in the form we're about to describe. Instead, he saw this as an idealized structure that many of the later Indo-European societies would aspire towards, which allows him to neatly sidestep many of the issues we're going to bring up with this theory afterwards. Dumezil's three structures went as follows. Firstly, you had those who brought order and justice, typically the kings. This was the function of sovereignty. This was typically subdivided into two smaller subfunctions: the earthly sovereignty, which was usually kings as well as priests, and the heavenly sovereignty, which was usually represented by gods. Secondly, you had the warriors, who conquered and defended, the function of military. Thirdly, you had the rest, which included merchants and artisans and farmers and basically anything else you could think of, and was ruled over by the other two classes. The function of, well, I've actually heard several things. Mallory uses health, Lincoln uses artisanry, and Wikipedia uses fertility. So take your pick. One of Dumezil's best examples of this was reflected in something he referred to as Rome's archaic triad. The later triad in Rome would be Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. But Dumezil's triad was Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. Though this is hypothetical, Dumezil's arguments I find pretty convincing. And he's convinced not just me, but plenty of other scholars on this issue as well. Jupiter is very much the king, the keeper of oaths, the bringer of justice, and as such, very neatly fits into Dumezil's first function. Mars is the god of war. He both protects Rome and sends Rome out to conquer their enemies. So he very much fits the second function. And Quirinus, as a deified mortal who intercedes with the gods on behalf of the people of Rome, very much fits the third function. Often there was a bit of overlap. Jupiter would receive war spoils after all. But again, Dumezil saw this as an ideal structure, not necessarily one that was in practice at all times. And he saw this structure reflected in things like the courts of the kings of the Iranian Peninsula, or the Indian caste system, or even Plato's division of society. Note you can use the Greeks here because their mythological structure was the only thing that got corrupted, not necessarily their societal structure. Bruce Lincoln, professor emeritus, or lightly retired professor at the University of Chicago, wrote an opinion on Dumezil in his book Theorizing Myth that I think sums up the most common opinion on Dumezil I came across when looking into scholars talking about him. Namely, that though Dumezil's conclusions are mostly wrong, his methodology and his analysis has led to some really important lenses and insights that are still used to this day. Indeed, many criticisms of Dumezil are in that vein, that he's selective with his evidence, that he ignores pieces of evidence that might contradict his theories, and that really he's basing everything on two pillars, the language and then the comparative mythology. Now that first pillar is a very solid pillar. Comparative philology is still in use to this day. And it was really cool to find out about sound laws, these things which just happen to be a function of, how languages work and how they change and evolve. And the fact that you can use those laws to potentially uncover words from older languages which were never written down, which have no written component, that's really cool. That was something that was a lot of fun for me to look into. The second pillar, though, comparative analysis, runs into three huge problems. Three problems that, when I was researching for my paganism video, I saw right away. Okay, well, actually, I read other scholars who mentioned those issues, so then I was kind of primed to already see them. So then when I was reading Dumezil, look, I'm not smart, okay? I just read a lot. Firstly, there's the issue of we don't really know how these gods might have shifted in importance, role, or focus. Mars is a fantastic example of this. We know that in the very early days of Rome, he was mostly an agricultural deity who also played a role in war. By the early empire, though, his agricultural duties were much less important overall, as he'd syncretized a lot more with the Greek god Ares. Think too about Christianity. The early religion was convinced the rapture was coming like tomorrow, whereas today we're much more chill about it. Well, some of us, anyway. So you're already running a pretty big risk of looking at the role of any specific god and trying to read that into some sort of proto-version of that god. Not to mention, the names of gods also shift. We can look at Minerva or Jupiter as great examples of this. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, but I mean, if there's a European god and an Iranian god and an Indian god, and they all share not just the same kind of role, but also an etymological root, I mean, doesn't that imply they also have to share, at the very least, some kind of conceptual root? And while that sounds reasonable, what complicates that is you immediately run into the second issue, the problem of parallel thinking. Now, there are numerous examples I can give of this, but let's just go with calculus, right? Calculus was invented by Newton when he was trying to do some physics stuff. But it was also invented by this guy Leibniz, who was just trying to do math, but tiny. Neither of them knew about the other's work. It just happened. Similarly, the wheel was invented independently by a bunch of different cultures, and famously the telephone had two different inventors. Alexander Graham Bell just happened to get to the patent office first. And if you want to ignore humans, there's straight up parallel evolution, where you can have separate animals evolving into similar animals in the modern day, though separated, like the European wolf and the Tasmanian wolf. Or for specific traits, how about wings? Birds and bats can both fly, but how they got those wings were in very different ways. To our discussion, parallel evolution can happen with both words and deities. Just as an example, take Dumezil's earlier thing of the centaurs. Whether or not you believe in the etymological root, it's entirely possible that these cultures already had concepts of half man, half animal creatures, and then independently developed those concepts into what they became, leading to the extreme differences in both form and function of these deities.
West himself even points out some issues with things like a chariot that pulls the sun, imagery we can see in the vast majority of Indo-European speaking cultures. However, from our understanding of the timing of the Proto-Indo-European migration, the chariot wouldn't have been invented at that point. The earliest examples we have come from thousands of years later, which would mean that it was instead an idea that was later disseminated throughout the Indo-European speaking peoples, not one that came with that initial migration, and therefore can't be attributed to the original Proto-Indo-European religion.
For another PIE-specific example, turns out you can't etymologically reconstruct the names of many PIE goddesses in the same way you can for gods, like Zeus and Jupiter. So what does that mean? Did the Proto-Indo-Europeans not have goddesses? Well, if so, there's only two options. The goddesses were already there, or the goddesses evolved as the result of parallel thinking. Now, if you want to think, okay, maybe the goddesses were already there, that's just evidence of syncretism. You've made several videos on that, and you're planning to make several more on that. That doesn't mean we can discount the evidence of the male gods. Well, now you're going to run into the third issue, the one that basically everyone I talked to struggled with, the issue of universalism. Because who's to say some of these ideas might not be universal in a sense? If we can find evidence of these tropes or stories in other cultures that never had contact with a PIE-speaking people, might that not imply the concepts weren't originally PIE? Now, you can take ML West's idea of, well, who cares if these things are universal? If we're trying to reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European culture, well, wouldn't universal things be included in that culture anyway? But you're running back into the problem I talked about all the way at the beginning of this video, straying too far from the basics. This is not an observable culture, religion, or mythology. This is purely a reconstruction, and the method of reconstruction is comparison. So, yeah, we see something in one pantheon, and we find it similar to something in another pantheon. If we use that to then say, oh, that means it must have come from the Proto-Indo-European pantheon, we're actually making a mistake. Because maybe it was never in the Proto-Indo-European pantheon, and it just happened to be in the two other ones, and therefore, though we're saying it came from that, it didn't at all. It didn't show up in either of the cultures until they merged with the later ones. And if those peoples spoke languages that were both descended from a common root language, they might end up with the same words for those gods. After all, imagine if you just think of Jupiter as Sky Father, and you get the word for father and sky from this common root language, you can have Zeus Pater and Io Pater right next to each other without either of the gods having been the same god originally. Recall, Dumezil himself does not think the eventual god of Zeus was an embodiment of a Proto-Indo-European deity, whereas he does think the eventual god of Jupiter was the descendant of a Proto-Indo-European deity, meaning that these two gods that share a very clear and very direct etymological root aren't actually the same deity underneath it all. This also really breaks down when you look at other cultures, like Semitic-speaking ones, like, oh, I don't know, one that wrote this little-known story where you have these two brothers, Cain and Abel, and one kills the other and then goes off and founds a city. And guess what? Rome has a similar story where there's two brothers and one kills the other and then founds a city, and that's often held up as a clear parallel of PIE influence. Not to mention, the Mayans, all the way on the other side of the world, also have divine twins who sacrifice themselves in order to create a new world. And the Mayans also have a thunder god who sits at the top of their pantheon, along with a couple other gods. To be fair, the thunder god isn't like the king, but still, this trope exists. When I brought this up before in arguments I was having in comments under the original Roman paganism video, the most common response to this I got was, well, maybe the Mayans and the Proto-Indo-Europeans, they just descended from an even more ancient, older group of people, which, okay, fine. All you're saying is if cultures have some sort of similarity, that means that they must have inherited it from some older culture, which just brings you right back around to universalism and basically renders the idea that the Proto-Indo-Europeans introduced their culture and religion to all these other cultures that didn't have anything like that before moot. Okay, sorry. God, that annoyed me so much when I got into this research. Thank all of you guys actually for voting for that. I'm not even being ironic or memeing here. Seriously, thank you guys, because I've been trying to argue with people on the internet a lot less, which is leading to a lot of pent-up energy. And this video, that rant, this has just been a great outlet for that energy. So thank you guys. Thank you all so much for that. I love doing spite research like this. It is a lot more fun. I always forget how fun it is until I do it, and then it's fun. It's a little fun to get riled up sometimes, you know? So hopefully by now you can understand that the PIE culture coming and overriding the indigenous culture and the indigenous religions of everywhere from Ireland to India just is not something that currently has widespread scholarly support. And even the staunchest supporters of PIE mythological construction, like Dumezil himself, don't use that reconstruction in order to create a specific deity or a specific pantheon, but rather as a lens through which we can more effectively analyze elements of those cultures. Actual modern scholarly theory, which again is not very popular, is that there was an overarching ideal societal structure in the PIE culture, which we can see reflected in the structure of that mythology, not in the mythology itself. Now again, I do want to hammer home, it's not as though reconstructive or comparative mythology is entirely a bunk science or not used at all. In fact, a really cool example of someone who did something really cool with comparative mythology comes to us from Levi Strauss. No relation, by the way. Weird, though, right? Claude Levi Strauss is his full name. Or Claude? I don't know how the French say it. He once did this incredible work, which spanned 4 entire books, tracing a single myth all the way from South America to the Arctic in North America, and documented all the changes that happened to it along the way. Now note, he didn't look at this and need the gods to be the same, or the characters to be the same, or anything like that. He looked at it from a structural lens. So by examining the structure of the myth, he was able to see how the myth grew, how the myth changed as it migrated like this. And in case you're wondering, no, the people from South America did not conquer all the way to North America. This was a myth that was exchanged by the standard method of cultural diffusion. And here, I'll give you a great example. You know pinky swearing? That is not European as far as we can tell. That is almost certainly Japanese. We know it in Japan goes all the way back to the 1600s. Pretty sure it only really popped up in the last 100, maybe 150 years. And last time I checked, the Japanese did not conquer America. If anything, it was the other way around. All of that just to say the idea that there was some sort of unified PIE culture, which again, we don't even know that it was a single monoculture. It probably was a lot of smaller subcultures. The idea that that culture spread all the way from Ireland to India, and it overwrote those indigenous peoples, cultures, and religions, and what have you, or if you don't want to say overwrote, fused with them so heavily that it's, 50-50 or 60-40 or whatever. That idea is just not something taken seriously by the vast majority of modern scholars. But sadly, or well, fortunately actually, if you like longer videos, the story does not end there. Because fans of the theory have likely been saying, what about the DNA evidence? You see, recently, we have developed some technologies that make testing the DNA of older bodies that we found, I'm talking bodies that are like hundreds to thousands of years old, much more accurate and give much more useful results. And these tests have showed that there was some sort of migration from some steppe peoples out to the rest of Europe. And some fans of this theory go so far as to say the DNA evidence proves that these Proto-Indo-European people, well, a later group of these people, but still that same kind of cultural area, those people wiped out all the men in the area and took the women as concubines and had kids with them. So in that case, I mean, even if cultural reconstruction can never be definitive, and even if comparative mythology isn't used in the way we'd like to use it, what does that matter if we have evidence that these men moved to these regions and then had kids there? If culture is, as you say, Port, so very important to people, why wouldn't they bring their culture with them? And if the men were all gone and these were the only men left to provide for the women, well, why wouldn't their sons end up practicing the same culture that they had? And my answer, very simply, is they didn't. The people who arrived in Greece and Rome and India and basically everywhere outside of Russia and the Baltic states, and a little bit in Scandinavia and maybe England as well, weren't direct descendants of those Proto-Indo-Europeans that you're talking about. The people who arrived there were descendants of their descendants who had gone through several generations. And if the idea that culture can be transmitted genetically is the thing that you really want to hang your hat on, I don't think you're going to like the end conclusion the evidence points to. So let's now talk about the fun and exciting field that science only opened up for us fairly recently, the field of archaeogenetics. In 2015, this paper came out that really shook up a lot of the field on Proto-Indo-European studies. If you recall, there were two main areas the Proto-Indo-Europeans were thought to have come from, either the steppe or Anatolia. So this guy, Wolfgang Hack, fantastic name by the way, et al., can't forget about them, did this DNA analysis of 69 bodies that are dated from between 8 and 3,000 years ago. Now that might not sound like many bodies, but you actually don't need that many data points to determine trends of this scale, assuming, of course, your sampling is actually representative. And the data pretty clearly shows that the Anatolian hypothesis was bunk and the steppe hypothesis was the correct one. At least, that's what you'd think if you listen to how people on the internet talk about it. When I first encountered this paper, it was sent to me to show that it was evidence that the PIE people had come into Europe and overwritten the male DNA that was in there. The explanation of this was that most of the genetic changes were observed on the Y chromosomal line, so obviously coming from the male, whereas the X chromosomal line, mitochondrial, power of the cell, mothers and all that good stuff, was not heavily changed at all. The person I was talking with was trying to use this evidence that warrior bands of nomadic steppe men had come into Europe, killed all the men, banged all the women. And even ignoring the problem of, women also get an X chromosome from their father, so, the women would still have an X chromosome from those PIE people, which they could then pass on to their daughters and sons and so on and so forth. You run into the much bigger problem of when you dig into it, that is just not the story the data is telling. But the problem is, the story he presented me with is just such a good story. Like, a lot of what I frequently run into when I make my history videos is balancing a good story, I'm making a video after all, with what I could say is true and what I have to be more uncertain about. My brother's Grackeye video is actually a great example of this. By comparing stories, I end up not believing in the evil brothers who were trying to seize power from the Republic or the, valiant heroes fighting to defend the working class, but rather just politicians using populism as an indirect means to seize power. Like, there's a reason it's one of my worst performing videos. When you dig into it more, when you see what these scholars actually published, you can almost immediately see that the story of, roving warrior bands, conquering these places and taking these women isn't what the data shows at all. I'm also going to apologize in advance because digging into raw data like this is one of the most fun things for me. So let's start with graphs. So this graph is the genetic makeup of modern Europeans. And you'll notice the green here is labeled Yamnaya. And that is because, like I said, we don't actually have evidence of the PIE peoples. So it is thought that the PIE-speaking peoples came to Europe through the Yamnaya, which were a culture that we actually have documented and we actually can find, graves of and burial sites of and whatnot, which means we know what their DNA was like. You'll notice how for this region, so like Eastern Europe to the UK, it's like half Yamnaya DNA, with that number slowly decreasing as you get to Western and Southern parts of Europe, like Spain, Italy, and Greece. Now, if you're noticing, Albania also has very little Yamnaya DNA, which, how interesting. When, if you look at the family tree of Proto-Indo-Europeans, you'll notice Albania has their own branch, separate from all the others. Almost like languages spread in ways other than conquest and genetics. So now let's turn to some of the more ancient bodies we've uncovered, which you can see in this graph.
One other thing I need to bring up real quick. In these studies, when they refer to corded ware peoples, they lived in this area, so northeastern Europe, whereas Bell Beakers, the people living around the northern Mediterranean who'd eventually turn into the Apennine culture, which in turn would become the Roman culture, would not be descended from that group. although some of that culture would exist north of the Alps.
This map is kind enough to show us where all of these bodies were recovered from. And you can see most of the later bodies, such as the corded ware and the Karsdorf, and I'm not even going to try pronouncing the rest of those, were all recovered from here. Right away, you'll notice a pretty huge split. We do actually have some steppe DNA showing up, specifically Yamnaya.
Overall, this study provides very strong evidence that the Yamnaya people migrated to Europe, consistent with the spread of PIE languages. However, the study itself notes our data further shows that both migrations were followed by resurgences of the previous inhabitants. First, during the Middle Neolithic, when hunter-gatherer ancestry rose again after its early Neolithic decline, and then between the late Neolithic and the present, when farmer and hunter-gatherer ancestry rose after its late Neolithic decline. This second resurgence must have started during the late Neolithic Bronze Age period itself. So if you want to claim the DNA shows the Yamnaya migrated, that's fine. But if you want to say they conquered or replaced indigenous Europeans, you're going to be stuck explaining why their DNA declined by the Bronze Age, which, as we'll get to, was well before they reached Rome.
Now, that same year, another study came out from Allentoft et al., which indicated that Caucasian DNA from the
Caucasus
mountains, had also been introduced to Europe through the Yamnaya population. However, they interestingly note that Italy seemed to be exempt from this genetic influence. They also note that while our genomic evidence corresponds well with the hypothesized expansion of the Indo-European languages, we find only weak evidence for admixture in Yamnaya, and only when using Bronze Age Armenians and Upper Paleolithic Malta. So even they are noting that there's a pretty important gap in the traditional hypothesis. Now, my ellipses over there are actually eliding over a fairly important distinction, where they say, in contrast to recent findings, with them directly referencing that Hawk paper. But as we literally just went over that, we'll move on. Now, of course, this is far from the only study done in this area, though again, I will caution, 10 years is nothing in academic time. It is entirely possible new evidence comes out tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that throws all of this out the window. So in 2021, Gabriele Scarano et al., can't forget about them, gave a different analysis of the genetic and cultural impact of the steppe migration into Europe. And this is the paper that, in my opinion, gets twisted the most by internet fans of the mythology overriding bands of warriors theory. Scarano gives us another beautiful chart and even keeps the same colors as Hawk, which just huge points right there. But on top of that, she even includes error bars. She could have just included that in the footnote like 90% of other people do. But no, you put it right there in the graph. You can see how certain she is of these results. It honestly can make you weep sometimes when the data is this beautifully presented. Now you can again see where there is the most Yamnaya DNA. In fact, let's reorder it like this. So you can see the corded ware groups have the most, with the Northeastern European bell beakers having the second most. But by the time you get into Italy, the bell beaker cultures down there basically don't have any influence whatsoever. Like it's a minuscule amount of Yamnaya DNA. As a last note, this study basically concludes that most of the evidence shows up in the Y chromosomal DNA, indicating a male lineage. However, and this is another thing that really annoys me, I'm sorry if you're new to the channel. Normally, I limit myself to just one rant per video, but stuff like this annoys the absolute crap out of me because, like, when you dig into these studies yourself, you pretty quickly actually do see how people can misinterpret this data. Because you look through it, and if someone says, this is what the data says, and that's the only thing you hear, and then you read into the data, you go, oh, I see how the data can say that. But the problem is, once you read a little bit deeper than that, you see that that's not what it says at all. And the academics are always really careful about that when they're writing these things. Like, they will always say, we saw X, but that doesn't necessarily mean Y. And then everyone looks at the paper and goes, oh my God, they saw X. That means Y. And they run around telling everyone else that. And then someone like me has to come along and dig through what honestly is very technical, very dense, incredibly annoying stuff to read through. Although, also to be fair to the academics, they are pretty good at explaining a lot of this stuff. You have to Google a couple terms. You have to make sure that you know what they're referring to. And you can never assume that you understand what a word means. But they do make it pretty easy. But like, stuff like this is very annoying to me. I get how people are led astray, but it's like, God, just read the study. Just read the study. I guarantee you, 9 times out of 10, you will understand what it is saying if you actually sit down and read it. Anyway, in addition to the very obvious plain English sentence, as the available Y chromosome data is not a good proxy to quantify the male contribution from the step-related ancestry, Scarano goes into far more detail, talking about the actual DNA markers they found. She mentions that most of what they found is the R1A M47 DNA marker. So that is how we know that a lot of these people have steppe ancestry. But interestingly, no Yamnaya male has ever been found with this marker. And the marker that is far more common in Yamnaya DNA, R1B M269, is only found in 3 of the Bell Beaker samples from Central Europe, and in none of the corded ware. So this soup of numbers implies something very interesting. Though there was clearly some steppe influence and therefore steppe migration, the timing must be off. And it can't necessarily imply that they came from that same Yamnaya wave of migration that everyone points to later. Most modern Europeans, myself, you, everyone else, is part of that R1BM269 group. We have that DNA marker if you have some European ancestry, more than likely, and you're a guy.
So when the study says that migration was male-driven, they're not referring to the overall genetic sequence, they're referring to the markers which, again, were not exclusively Yamnaya.
Now, if you recall, this video all started from arguments I was getting into with people from my Roman paganism video. So let's fast forward a bit. Let's go past the year 3000, get all the way to the year 1000. Well, 900, 700, basically to the start of Rome as Rome. Now keep in mind, my initial argument in that video was that Rome's religious origins did not come from some sort of shared Proto-Indo-European base, that it was native to the peoples who were living in Italy with a little bit of mixture from other people who arrived in the area that we can tell from a change in burial practices around that time. They did receive some later influence from the Etruscans and, of course, the Greeks, but the core of their religion, the thing everything else was built around, was unmistakably Roman. So given we've already dealt with the comparative mythology side of the argument, as well as the reconstructive mythology side of the argument, let's now deal with the DNA side of the argument. If you want the genetic argument to hold up, then by 900 BC, 700 BC, somewhere in that range, we should see a strong presence of Yamnaya DNA in Rome. And by 900 BC, there was some Yamnaya DNA, actually. But if you just stop there, you are going to miss the whole story. So let's get into the data. Side note, if you are still watching at this point, you either have fallen asleep or you are the same data-driven kind of freak as me, and I love you for that. Most of this comes from Margaret L. Antonio et al.'s study, Ancient Rome, A Genetic Crossroads of Europe and the Mediterranean. Now, firstly, this study agrees with all the ones that studied the older bodies that we just talked about, namely that in the Bronze Age, there was basically no Yamnaya DNA in Greece or Italy. And frankly, that kind of makes sense, because if you imagine, like, a bunch of people coming in through Russia, they'd have to cross the Alps to get into Italy, which wasn't exactly the easiest thing in 2000 BC, all right? There's a reason everyone talks about Hannibal as if it was impressive. Then there's that incredibly annoying gap we talked about for the end of the Bronze Age, and by the time we get to where my video started, 900 BC, started the Iron Age, we do actually have some steppe DNA showing up. And not just any steppe DNA, specifically that R1B strain. So I was wrong, right? No. Not even close. Now, there were several bodies tested from central Italy dated to around this period, but we're going to focus just on these 11 for reasons that are about to be very obvious. So the samples can be grouped into these batches found at these sites. And you'll notice, actually, for not having any samples from Rome itself, the spacing is pretty good. They got both north and south and, later samples from east and west. So honestly, it's pretty good coverage of the area. Now, because the larger claim is that the steppe ancestry was only male, even though, again, men pass on their X chromosomes too, but whatever, we are only going to look at the male samples that have Y chromosomes, so just these 7. So a more useful thing for us to look at is going to be the admixture, but just because everyone's going to care about this other thing that doesn't actually matter that much, we're first going to have to talk about haplotypes, but it's only going to take like 5 seconds. Haplotypes are a way we can trace groups of people back to a single genetic ancestor. This is done on the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. These are due to mutations that occur on these chromosomes, usually fairly unimportant mutations that don't really end up affecting anything too much, which is again why they're so much easier to track, because they're not really going to get overwritten or outcompeted for. And since they're random, like the majority of genetic changes, they're much more useful as a marker than indicative of anything deeper. You belonging to a particular haplogroup or haplotype doesn't necessarily mean you have some trait that someone from a different haplotype wouldn't have. Like, here's a fun fact. You and your cousins probably don't share the exact same haplogroup. It's genuinely not that uncommon, although you and your siblings sharing the exact same parents almost certainly will. Though even then, if your mother has two X chromosomes that belong to two different haplogroups, and you get, your dude, so you get one from your the X from your mom and the Y from your dad, it is possible that you would not share a haplogroup with your sisters. So there is that possibility. Therefore, haplogroups don't really tell you like how much of yourself comes from a certain place. Like, again, I belong technically one of my haplogroups, because obviously, you go back to a single ancestor, and then those single ancestors also all go back to a single, so on and so blah, 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 blah. Like, I have step DNA. I'm obviously not step. I just belong to that haplogroup. So a much more useful thing for us to look at is going to be the admixture, or how much of an individual's genetic profile can be mapped onto certain ethnic groups. And again, because men pass on both X chromosomes and Y chromosomes, something like this, I'm going to include the women as well.
And you get 23%. Just 23%. Not even a quarter. Not even a whole grandparent. Best case, if you just assume Y chromosome, then we can drop the women and get 21%, a lower admixture fraction. Originally, I was just going to put this in the companion doc, but it's probably worth saying here too. Admixtures are just models. You can see from the full genome analysis with this chart and graph, both impossible to read, and I can't find raw numbers which make them up anywhere, which is super annoying, but 20% seems around right. But seriously, what is this graph? Like, I get the logic, color is time and shape is genetic marker, but I genuinely cannot make out half the stuff. Why not give me a table of this as well? This admixture is only a two-way model, though, and as a result, there are 3 samples which don't fit that model at all, which are likely the Moroccan samples, though. Though, again, if they put the full genomic analysis in a table where I could access the numbers and raw data, I would be able to say that with a lot more certainty.
Again, this includes all the Iron Age samples, both men and women, so this is a much more complete picture. But if you really want to die on the haplogroup hill, and you say, hey, but wait, that also includes the mother, like we went over. The step DNA only came through the father. Again, not how that works. Men pass on their X chromosome to their daughters too. Like, let's genuinely take a situation that all the men are wiped out and a brand new group of men are introduced, okay? And all the new children are descended from, the indigenous women and the invasive men, okay? All the kids are going to be 50% of both. All of them, okay? And then when those kids have kids, all of those kids will still be 50%. That's just how genetic, well, on average. I mean, technically there's, you can get certain amounts from one person, but on average, they will all be 50%, and that will not change unless new genetic material is added in to the environment. So, again, let's start with that. But even ignoring that very obvious issue, what you're referring to isn't the Y DNA, it's the haplogroup marker on the Y chromosome. If the son of a step guy, who's, let's say, 50% step, 50% Euro, and he has a kid with a woman who's 100% Euro, that kid's only going to be 25% step. And then if that kid has another kid with, another Euro woman, now we're down to like 12.5. And the whole time, the Y chromosome stays the same, right? Unbroken male genetic line. That is one Y chromosome getting passed down over and over again. So the haplogroup stays exactly the same. How long do you want me to repeat that process until that kid is still considered a step child? Clearly, a full analysis, an admixture analysis, is going to be a lot more useful in proving or disproving this issue. Which leads to my second point. If you want to claim there was some sort of unbroken male line that proves this culture was carried through, you are facing a much higher percentage of Proto-Iranian DNA. That's Neolithic DNA. So before any migration, PIE step or otherwise happened. Not to mention, the overwhelming amount of Anatolian farmer DNA, which goes back even further. So we good here? For Rome, which is the main thing I wanted to talk about, the DNA argument is weak at best. But if you really want to die on that hill, you have to deal with the other 80% that's not step. Or if you want to just pretend it's on the Y chromosome, the other 60%. Now again, I think this overall argument is silly regardless. Even if the DNA showed what people wanted it to show, DNA doesn't spread culture any more than language does. Like, I may feel some connection to my Scotch-Irish roots, okay? Where are your wordy of a grace as longs my arm. But culturally, I'm American. God damn it. Before anyone starts yelling in the comments, just like they did about Brazil and Portugal, that there is a shared culture between me and the Anglos. And so clearly, I should go to that. I am 25% Irish. So is my wife. Is she Irish? My culture, American culture, came from a lot of different places. And you can't claim my culture is British any more than you can claim Egyptian culture is Turkish. Now, if you want to disagree with me, I'm not going to bring up the DNA argument because I don't think it would support your theory, even if it, showed what you wanted it to show. So I also don't think it supports my theory, even though it shows what I want it to show. So we good? Okay. Moving on. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is the modern state of Proto-Indo-European studies. Because, honestly, the thing I found the most when I was doing this research is just how wide and varied and, frankly, interesting the field still is. And this will also help answer the very obvious question of, if I'm talking about how flawed PIE reconstruction is and comparative mythology, why are there still books being published like a couple of years ago about comparative mythology or PIE culture? Why can you take graduate level courses about comparative PIE poetry? Well, because these days the focus is a lot more narrow and specific. One of the coolest things I came across in my research was this reader in comparative Indo-European religion. And though apologies to the University of Zagreb, however you say that, because they put this big warning at the top that this is only supposed to be used for Zagreb students, and please do not reproduce or put it anywhere else without the university's permission. But I'm just linking a website, so whoever hosted it on the website, that's who you should be mad at. So I crack open the reader fully expecting to find something that either was crazy, it didn't make sense, or was, just some weird pet project. What I found was way cooler than what I was expecting. Throughout the course of this companion reader, which again, I will stress in compliance with the book's warning, normally this is probably part of like a lecture course or some other series where there'd be some sort of in-person, ability to ask questions of a professor or something like this. But it mostly focuses on the idea of phrases, motifs, and other strictly linguistic reconstruction. For example, it looks at the wording swift horses. Notes that this appears in both the Rig Veda, in the Homeric in the Iliad, and also in Celtic poetry as well. It even demonstrates that these words all share an etymological root and keep that same style. Like one doesn't, use the word for mare and the other for foal or something like that. Now, the reader doesn't use this to claim, therefore the PIE mythological tradition clearly had some mythically swift horses that were important. It actually does the opposite. It looks at, since we can find other phrases that mean something akin to swift horses, but don't have that same etymological root and don't have that exact same phrasing, we can actually assume that structurally it still lasted into those languages, meaning that, on some level, swift horses was imagery that appeared in some sort of oral tradition going back, potentially, to the PIE-speaking peoples. And that's it. It stops there. It says, we can find a phrase, so there probably was a phrase. Nothing more, nothing less. If there is one thing I've come to appreciate about academia as I'm more and more exposed to it, they're really good at setting the limits of their knowledge and communicating that clearly to readers, as long as, you're willing to be open to them saying that. Like, when I was doing my research into Roman paganism, I had to stop myself from jumping to a lot of conclusions. And it's why I put so much emphasis on presenting conflicting pieces of evidence and alternative points of view. And a lot of what pushed me to that was the way scholars talked about the material. Like, if there was a specific archaeological site or something they had worked on, they would go into incredible detail about, like, we found this bone here and this bone here, and, this pottery thing had this spiral in this direction, but it only had 16 holes, and the other one had 17, so it was more important. But then, like, they'd go through that much specificity, and then they'd end with, so probably they had pottery. Or, well, the specific thing can't ever truly be known, so here's some fun theories to think about, but we can't really know about it, so let's just move on. Or they'd use that beautiful, beautiful word, maybe. And if you've watched my other videos, you'll know how much I love that word. Because when you peer back into history like this, especially the ancient past, you are going to run into maybes a lot. And while speculation is fun and all, you always need to keep in mind the limits of what you can confidently claim. Claiming we know that PIE overwrote the local religions is wrong. And even that kind of sneaky thing some people do where they go, well, I know it's technically just a theory, but I mean, it shouldn't be a theory. The evidence is pretty overwhelming. That's also wrong, because the evidence isn't overwhelming. The evidence is the evidence. That's it. Claiming we know that PIE overwrote all the local religions is wrong. But also, no serious PIE scholar has ever claimed that. Even Dumezil himself only went as far as saying heavy influence. And even that influence was mostly structural in nature. But if I were to sit here and claim there's no possible way any of that happened, I'd also be wrong. This is why the word theory is so important to all sciences, soft and hard. Gravity is a theory not because we don't know that it exists, but because we can't answer every single question about it. And so we need to leave certain elements of the theory of gravity open for later evidence that might come to light. And this, to me, is the biggest problem. Not just with the PIE overriding mythology theory, but frankly with all of these historical conspiracy theories. Because at the end of the day, all these conspiracy theories are a really good story. If I were to title this video like, The Secret Society That Once Ruled Eurasia, that's a cool story. People are going to click on that. I'm going to click on that because that's a really interesting story you want to hear. But the problem is there's just not enough evidence to support that story and plenty of evidence that counters it. But if I present my story of, hey, did you know there's a bunch of different cultures and they're actually all unique and different, and any similarities that you might be able to see is actually just the result of, universalities that can say, and you're already asleep, aren't you? Which is a more interesting story? The CIA killed JFK because he was about to destroy them, or some dude with a gun went crazy. My story just isn't anywhere near as cool as that. The one thing my story has going for it is evidence. And frankly, I think that evidence still points to a really cool story buried in there somewhere. Like the fact that I can go to Ireland and then, hop on a plane and go to New Delhi and they're speaking languages that descended from this single language. That's really cool. And then I'm so curious, like, why did that language spread? Was there some sort of utility? Did it, have words to describe things that other things didn't describe? Were the sounds easier to pronounce? Did it sound nicer? Like, what happened there? But unfortunately, I can't sit here and answer those questions. And frankly, I don't think anyone can, no matter how cool the story is. But maybe, there's that word again, maybe that's okay. Maybe seeing how far a single language can spread is already pretty cool. I hope you all enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. And donate. Donate to Car for Ukraine, seriously. I care a lot about this, and I really think we can do some good. I think it'd be really cool. And then we get to see a video of a car. Probably not a video of the car blowing up, but still, it'd be cool, I think. I know a lot of people have been asking about Patreons, memberships, like how they can support the channel financially. I think I'm going to launch that with next month's video. No promises. I'm going to try. But for this month, just do the Car for Ukraine stuff. Please give the money to them. They very much need it more, especially now. As I'm recording this, Zelensky just went to the White House. So, everything we can do to kind of push those lines back is going to help in the negotiations that I guess are happening now. Tune into William Spaniel to learn more about that. Seriously, a lot of you guys are also subscribed to William Spaniel's channel, Lines on Maps. So you really care about Ukraine, supposedly. So, how about we donate some money, do some cool stuff, and then, maybe we're part of the news in Ukraine. Wouldn't that be cool? And I'm going to start spamming your feeds with posts about it if we don't hit the goal. So let's try and do it. We have a couple of months, but, let's do it now. And then, if you don't want to unsubscribe, you can get that. I'm going to put out a bit of a companion video to this one at some point, talking about the differences between the Greek and Roman gods, because that was technically what you guys were voting on in the first place. But when I was doing the research, I realized Greek gods aren't Proto-Indo-European. So the whole thing kind of became moot, I can speak. And then hopefully next will be that new video that I've been teasing for a while. I'm very excited about that one. Very excited to see what you all think about it. I genuinely can't wait for you all to see what I have in store. I love, love, love this community we're building. I love when I put out a new video and I get so many people in the comments disagreeing with me, but engaging with my sources. Like, you guys don't just come in and say like, Port, you're stupid, you're wrong. You're like, Port, you didn't consider this translation of this document. God, I get some amazing emails of people like talking about like the specific uses of Latin words in certain ways. God, I love this community. I love what you guys are doing. Seriously, this is so much fun. So sorry, that's a little, anyway, until next time, take care.